Hey everyone, have you ever found yourself replaying moments, imagining conversations, or feeling the presence of someone without a single word being exchanged? If he's always in your mind without any communication, it means something. It speaks to the intricate and beautiful complexity of human connection. Let's explore what it might mean. When someone occupies our thoughts without any direct communication, it's a profound reminder of how connection doesn't always require words or actions to feel real. It's a silent thread woven deeply into the fabric of our emotions and memories that keeps someone present in our mind. This silent connection can emerge from a single shared moment, a meaningful gesture, or the way someone made us feel during an interaction. Sometimes it isn't even about what was said, but rather the unspoken resonance, the feeling of being understood or seen in a way that stays with us long after the moment has passed. The absence of communication doesn't diminish the connection. In fact, it can amplify its significance. Without the distractions of everyday conversation, the mind turns inward, replaying memories, imagining scenarios, or pondering the deeper meaning of the bond. It's in this space that the connection can feel even stronger, taking on a life of its own within our internal world. The silence becomes a canvas where emotions, hopes, and even unresolved questions can unfold, creating a rich and complex tapestry of what that person means to us. Silent connection also speaks to the power of our emotional memory. We are wired to remember not just events, but how people make us feel. Even without communication, the imprint they leave on us can echo through our daily lives. It's why a song, a smell, or even a fleeting thought can trigger an avalanche of emotions tied to that person. Their presence in our mind becomes less about logic and more about the emotional energy they carry, an energy that somehow aligns with our own in a way that feels significant, even if it defies explanation. There's something profoundly human about this kind of connection. It shows how deeply we are influenced by relationships, even those that exist in silence. It reflects our capacity for empathy, imagination, and longing. It's not just about the person we're thinking of, but also about ourselves, how we process emotions, how we value connection, and how we hold space for people in our lives, even when they are physically or communicatively absent. This silent bond can act as a mirror, showing us not just who they are to us, but who we are because of them. It's both a reflection of our inner world and a testament to the power of connection that words alone could never fully capture. Emotional bonding that transcends words is one of the most profound experiences we can have as human beings. It's that deep, unspoken understanding, the kind that doesn't rely on verbal communication to express itself. It exists in the spaces between words, in the quiet moments shared between two people, and in the way emotions can be felt without the need for explanation. This bond speaks directly to our hearts, reaching beyond the surface level interactions and connecting on a much more visceral level. It's the way a glance can convey more than 1,000 words, or how a simple touch can communicate comfort, care, or reassurance in ways that language struggles to express. In these moments, there's an exchange of energy that words cannot encapsulate, a knowing that passes between people without the need to articulate it. This kind of emotional bonding is rooted in trust and vulnerability. It's the kind of connection that says, I see you even when you're not speaking, and I understand you, even without hearing your thoughts. It goes beyond shared experiences or the simple passing of time together. It's the bond formed when two souls recognize and resonate with each other's essence in a way that feels inherently right, even without the need for direct conversation. This form of bonding can be incredibly powerful because it often arises during moments of intense emotional vulnerability. When we are able to be truly open without the need to defend ourselves or protect our hearts, the connection we form with others often deepens. The absence of words becomes an invitation to trust, to feel safe enough to share the quiet parts of ourselves that are harder to articulate. The emotional bond that develops in these spaces isn't fragile, it's resilient because it doesn't rely on constant communication to be validated. It's already present, silently, waiting for us to acknowledge it. And yet, this bond often reveals the complexity of human relationships. While words may be absent, emotions are still being communicated, often louder than anything that could be said aloud. Whether it's the feeling of comfort in someone's presence, the shared understanding in a silence between you, or the sense of peace that comes when you don't need to explain yourself, these moments can be incredibly profound. They hold within them the power to strengthen a connection, to affirm that the bond is real and meaningful, even when it isn't spoken. In many ways, emotional bonding beyond words taps into a deeper layer of our humanity, the part of us that understands that true connection is not just about the things we say, but about how we make others feel and how we are made to feel in return. It's an unspoken language, one that carries weight and meaning, often more than the words we use to try to express it. Unpacking the why behind someone's constant presence in our thoughts, despite the lack of communication, requires deep introspection and self-awareness. It forces us to look beneath the surface, to question the feelings that arise when we think of that person, and to explore what lies at the core of this emotional attachment. This why often doesn't have an obvious answer at first glance, and it can be a complex mix of emotions, experiences, and unmet needs that have intertwined in our subconscious, making that person occupy a prominent space in our minds. The why can sometimes stem from the way that person makes us feel, whether they offer comfort, validation, or a sense of being understood. When someone enters our lives and has an impact on us, their presence often triggers emotions we may not have fully processed, like longing, nostalgia, or even unresolved hurt. These emotions may stay with us, lingering in the background, even when there is no active communication. The mind is a powerful thing, and when emotions are tied to someone, it can create an unshakable feeling that keeps them present in our thoughts, even without direct interaction. Another layer to the why is the role of memory. Human beings are creatures of habit, and we often hold on to memories that carry emotional significance. A single interaction, a glance, a shared laugh, or even a moment of vulnerability can leave an imprint on our minds that lasts far beyond the actual event. It's as though the mind archives these moments in a special place, revisiting them during quiet moments when we're alone with our thoughts. The why becomes a way for us to make sense of these memories, trying to piece together the meaning they hold in the grander narrative of our lives. The presence of this person, even without communication, can feel like an anchor to those memories, bringing them to the forefront of our consciousness and pulling us back to that time, whether we want to go there or not. The why may also be tied to our deeper emotional needs, particularly those of connection, intimacy, and belonging. When someone becomes a central figure in our mind, it often reflects a desire for closeness or a fear of emotional isolation. In some cases, it's the void that person fills in our hearts, the unspoken need for a sense of emotional safety, love, or companionship that keeps them in our thoughts. This silent connection is our subconscious way of holding on to something we yearn for, whether or not we are actively pursuing it. It's the mind's way of fulfilling a desire for connection that hasn't been met or hasn't been fully expressed. It's not necessarily about the person themselves, but about what they represent to us, a longing for something deeper, something more real, something more lasting. The why can also be rooted in the hope of something left unresolved or unfinished. There may have been a connection that was left hanging, a conversation that never took place, or emotions that were never fully expressed. The unspoken or unresolved nature of this connection keeps us tethered to it, causing us to revisit it repeatedly in our minds, searching for closure or understanding. It's as though the mind refuses to let go until all the pieces are in place, even if it means holding on to the person in a silent, uncommunicated way. The why behind this can be the unresolved need for closure or the desire to make sense of something that doesn't feel complete. The absence of communication only heightens this sense of incompleteness, making the person a constant presence in our thoughts as we try to figure out what might have been or what could still be. There is also the possibility that the why stems from an idealization of the person or the connection itself. When communication is limited or absent, our minds often fill in the gaps with the idealized version of the person we wish they were or the relationship we wish we had. In the absence of reality, we construct narratives based on our hopes, dreams, and fantasies. This can result in a person becoming an almost mythical figure in our minds, someone who represents the potential for something we desire. The why becomes a reflection of our internal wishes and hopes rather than an objective reality, and this can cause the person to linger in our thoughts far longer than they might in the actual course of our lives. This quest to understand the why is a journey of self-discovery. It asks us to confront our emotional truths, our attachments, and our vulnerabilities. It forces us to reflect on what it is we truly need from others and what role this person is playing in fulfilling that need, whether consciously or unconsciously. It requires us to peel back the layers of our emotional landscape and examine what drives our desires and attachments. Sometimes the answers to this why are not immediately clear, and the process of unpacking it can be messy and challenging. But in that exploration, we often uncover pieces of ourselves we didn't know existed, and we gain insight into the emotional patterns that shape our connections with others. Vulnerability plays an essential and transformative role in our emotional lives, especially when it comes to the depth of our connections with others. It's often seen as a weakness or something to protect ourselves from, but in reality, vulnerability is one of the most courageous and powerful tools we have for building meaningful relationships. When someone occupies our thoughts without communication, vulnerability can be at the core of that silent connection. It's the willingness to feel deeply, to allow ourselves to be affected by someone, even when the relationship is unspoken or incomplete. At its heart, vulnerability is about allowing ourselves to be seen, to let others witness our inner world, including our fears, hopes, and desires. In the absence of communication, when a person lingers in our minds, it's often because we've allowed ourselves to open up to the emotional pull they have on us. Even without words, we've offered a piece of our hearts by holding space for them in our thoughts. This act of emotional exposure creates a powerful bond, one that doesn't need constant verbal affirmation to exist, yet it requires us to remain open to the feelings they evoke in us. Vulnerability asks us to be honest with ourselves about why that person holds such a strong place in our mind and heart, even in the silence. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we risk the possibility of hurt, rejection, or disappointment. This is especially true when there is no direct communication. We are essentially giving someone power over our emotions, even without them being aware of it. In this space, we make ourselves susceptible to the ebb and flow of emotions that come with longing, hope, or even regret. And yet, vulnerability is the birthplace of authentic connection. It's the willingness to stand in the unknown, with all its uncertainties and emotional risks, and still be open to the possibility that something beautiful may emerge. The lack of communication doesn't erase the vulnerability. In many ways, it heightens it because we are left to navigate our feelings without the security of a response or reassurance. This kind of vulnerability also speaks to our capacity for longing and desire. When someone occupies our thoughts silently, it's often because there's an emotional need that hasn't been fully met or expressed. We might long for their presence, their understanding, or simply the comfort that comes from knowing they are thinking of us in return. Vulnerability shows up in these moments of emotional yearning, when we allow ourselves to crave connection without the certainty of it being reciprocated. We are willing to feel the discomfort of wanting something we may not have, and that's where true emotional strength lies. The vulnerability in that desire doesn't weaken us, it strengthens our ability to sit with uncertainty, to process our emotions without requiring immediate resolution. Another layer of vulnerability in this context is the acceptance of imperfection. When someone is always on our minds without direct communication, it can highlight the messiness of our emotions. There may be confusion, unspoken feelings, or things left unsaid that create a sense of discomfort. Vulnerability invites us to embrace this imperfection and to acknowledge that we don't always have the answers. It asks us to accept the complexity of human connection, recognizing that not all bonds are neat or tidy. The emotional space we hold for someone, even in silence, is an act of embracing the unknown, the messy, unformed parts of the relationship that haven't yet been fully explored. We allow ourselves to feel, to wonder, and to lean into the rawness of our emotions without having all the answers. Moreover, vulnerability in this context can also be an invitation for growth. It's an opportunity to learn about ourselves, our emotional needs, and our capacity for connection. When we experience vulnerability without communication, it becomes a mirror that reflects our inner world. Why are we holding on to these thoughts? What is it we need to feel truly seen or understood? Are we trying to resolve something from the past, or are we creating space for something new to unfold? By allowing ourselves to sit with these questions, we not only come closer to understanding the person who occupies our thoughts, but also the aspects of ourselves that are shaped by that connection. Vulnerability creates the space for self-discovery, allowing us to uncover layers of our emotional landscape that may have been hidden or overlooked. In relationships that are marked by silence, vulnerability can also be a means of transformation. The way we choose to engage with the silence, whether we allow it to overwhelm us or we sit with it and make meaning of it, can shape the course of our emotional journey. We might feel afraid to reach out, unsure of what the silence means or whether our feelings are returned. Yet, the act of being vulnerable with our emotions, of owning our thoughts and desires without expecting a particular outcome, can transform the way we approach the connection. Even if we choose not to communicate, vulnerability allows us to process our emotions in a way that brings clarity, strength, and insight. It helps us move through uncertainty with grace, accepting that vulnerability doesn't always require immediate action, but rather the willingness to feel deeply and fully, regardless of the external circumstances. Navigating the balance between silent connection and emotional presence without communication is one of the most delicate and nuanced aspects of human relationships. It is a constant dance between honoring the depth of feelings and knowing when to hold space for someone in our hearts, while also understanding when those same emotions may start to weigh us down or create an unhealthy attachment. This balance is not always easy to find, and it requires a level of self-awareness and emotional intelligence to determine when to lean into the silence and when it's time to release it. At its core, the balance is about knowing that it's okay to hold someone in our hearts, even if they are not physically or actively present in our lives. The silent bond, the presence of someone in our thoughts without communication, speaks to the emotional depth we are capable of experiencing. But that emotional presence, when unchecked, can begin to consume us. It's easy to get lost in the mental replay of past interactions, the imagined trias, or the constant yearning for something that isn't currently available. The balance comes in recognizing when these thoughts are empowering and uplifting and when they are draining or distorting our sense of reality. It's about being honest with ourselves about how this emotional connection is affecting us, whether it is something that gives us strength and clarity or something that keeps us in a loop of longing and uncertainty. Navigating this balance also requires us to recognize the fine line between healthy attachment and emotional dependence. When someone occupies our thoughts without communication, it's easy to start believing that their presence, whether in reality or in memory, is necessary for our emotional well-being. The mind can create a false narrative that our happiness is incomplete without their acknowledgement, their attention, or their response. This is where the balance becomes tricky. At what point does silent connection start to feel like a weight rather than a comfort? At what point does the absence of communication no longer feel like an invitation to self-reflection or growth, but instead like a barrier that keeps us stuck? The emotional strength required to hold on to someone without needing them to meet our emotional needs is immense. But it is in this strength that true emotional independence can be found. It's about learning to enjoy and appreciate the bond without attaching your sense of worth or fulfillment to it. Another layer to this balance is the recognition that silence and emotional connection are not inherently negative. They are simply an expression of where the relationship is at a given moment. Sometimes we may find ourselves in a space where communication is not possible, whether due to distance, circumstance, or personal choice. In these moments, holding onto the connection silently can be a beautiful expression of care, respect, and understanding. Yet, there's a risk that we may fall into the trap of idealizing the connection, creating a mental picture of the relationship that is not based in reality, but in our own emotional projections. Navigating the balance requires us to acknowledge if a person is always on our mind without communication, it could be a sign of something we need to address, whether it's reaching out to them to bridge the gap, processing our own emotions, or simply acknowledging that the connection we once had is evolving or fading. Recognizing when the balance shifts from being a healthy emotional practice to something that holds us in a place of stagnation is crucial. Often it requires the courage to face the discomfort of uncertainty and the willingness to let go of what we cannot control. This is where emotional maturity comes into play, understanding that we cannot force communication and that sometimes the healthiest thing we can do for ourselves is to release the need for constant validation from someone who isn't present in the way we want or expect. In these moments, it's about trusting ourselves to step into the unknown and allowing the emotional space to be what it needs to be without clinging too tightly to it. The balance also involves an internal dialogue between the mind and the heart. When someone is always on our mind without communication, the heart yearns for connection, but the mind often brings in practicality, logic, and the reality of the situation. How do we honor the emotional depth while also acknowledging the limitations of what we can control? How do we hold space for someone in our thoughts without allowing that space to take over our lives? The mental aspect of this balance requires us to be mindful and intentional about how much emotional energy we invest in someone who may not be actively contributing to the relationship. It's about learning to let go of the need to fill every empty space with thoughts of that person and instead creating a healthy internal boundary that allows us to focus on our own growth, healing, and well-being. Balancing the emotional need for connection with a rational understanding of where the relationship stands is a practice of emotional discipline, one that is cultivated through time, patience, and reflection. Ultimately, the balance comes down to choice. We can choose to let someone occupy our thoughts without communication in a way that nourishes us, making space for reflection and growth, or we can allow it to become something that drains our emotional energy, keeping us stuck in a cycle of longing and uncertainty. The key is to recognize that we hold the power to determine how much emotional space we give to someone, and that balance is an ongoing, evolving process. It's not something we achieve once and for all, but rather something we continually assess, adjust, and refine as we move through life's relational landscape. This requires self-compassion and patience, acknowledging that there will be times when we feel off balance and other times when we find a deep sense of peace and clarity. Choosing communication, particularly in situations where a person occupies our thoughts without any direct exchange, is an act of vulnerability, intention, and courage. It's easy to let silence linger, to allow a person's absence to become something we carry within ourselves, assuming that the connection will somehow remain intact despite the lack of verbal or emotional engagement. However, choosing to break that silence and reach out is a decision that often requires us to confront our own fears, uncertainties, and insecurities. It forces us to step out of the comfort of the silent connection and into the potential vulnerability that comes with opening up to someone, even when we don't know how they will respond or if they will respond at all. When we choose to communicate, we are not just reaching out to the other person, we are also communicating with ourselves. It is an acknowledgement of our needs, our desires, and the emotional space that has been held in silence. By choosing to express ourselves, we are taking the first step toward not only understanding the other person better, but also gaining clarity on our own feelings. Communication is a bridge between the internal world and the external world. It takes what has been internalized, the emotions, the thoughts, the longing, and brings them into the open, where they can be shared, understood, and perhaps even reciprocated. But this process can be fraught with uncertainty. There's always a risk when we reach out, whether it's the fear of rejection, the worry that our feelings won't be returned, or the anxiety that will be misunderstood. Choosing communication is also about timing. It's about understanding the emotional context and the dynamics of the situation. Sometimes the silence is not a barrier, but a space for reflection and growth, both for ourselves and the other person. It's important to recognize when communication is the healthiest choice and when it might be better to sit with the silence a little longer. The timing of our communication can have a significant impact on how it is received and how it affects the emotional balance of the relationship. If we choose to reach out too soon, before we've processed our own emotions or before we've given the other person space to reflect, it may come across as pressured or insincere. But if we wait too long, we might miss the opportunity to address something important or allow the emotional distance to grow wider, making communication even more challenging. At its core, choosing communication is about taking responsibility for our own emotional landscape. It's recognizing that we are the ones who hold the power to shape the course of our relationships, to create the possibility for connection, and to express what we need. When we stay silent, we are allowing the unknown to take over, often letting assumptions or imagined scenarios fill the gaps left by the absence of communication. By choosing to speak, we bring those assumptions to light and offer a chance for clarity. It allows us to share our perspective, to articulate our feelings, and to open the door for the other person to do the same. It is a courageous act that requires us to be honest and vulnerable, to take the risk that the conversation may not go the way we hope, but to do so with the understanding that, regardless of the outcome, we will have been true to ourselves. However, choosing communication also involves recognizing that it's not always about saying everything on our minds. Often it's about being clear and intentional with our words. We may feel the urge to over-explain or say more than what is necessary, driven by our own anxiety or fear of not being understood. But effective communication is often less about quantity and more about quality. It's about speaking from a place of clarity where we have taken the time to understand our own feelings and are able to express them in a way that is respectful, thoughtful, and concise. The act of choosing communication is not only about what we say, but how we say it. It's about creating a space where the other person feels comfortable enough to engage in the conversation without feeling overwhelmed or pressured. In this way, communication is an invitation to mutual understanding, not a demand for validation. Furthermore, choosing communication is about giving the other person the opportunity to meet us in the same way. It's about recognizing that just as we have been sitting with our emotions in silence, they may have their own thoughts, feelings, and experiences that have shaped their response or lack thereof to us. By choosing to communicate, we are not only revealing ourselves, but also offering them the chance to be open and vulnerable in return. Communication is a two-way street, and when we open that door, we create the possibility for the other person to express themselves freely. This exchange is what allows relationships to deepen and evolve, as it creates a space for both parties to share their truths, to listen, and to grow together. The choice to communicate is also an expression of self-respect. It is an acknowledgement that we deserve to be heard, to have our feelings recognized, and to have the space to express ourselves without fear of judgment or dismissal. When we choose to speak our truth, we are honoring our emotional needs and giving ourselves permission to be fully present in the relationship. It's a reminder that our thoughts and feelings are valuable and that we are worthy of being seen and understood. By choosing to communicate, we are reclaiming our voice, stepping into our power, and asserting that we are not passive recipients of silence, but active participants in the relationship. At the same time, choosing communication also involves the understanding that it may not always result in the outcome we expect or desire. The response we receive may not match the level of vulnerability we've offered, and it may not bring the closure or clarity we hope for. But that doesn't mean that the act of communicating was in vain. Even if the conversation doesn't unfold as we imagined, the simple act of speaking up and expressing ourselves is a powerful statement of self-awareness, emotional growth, and authenticity. It's a declaration that we are not defined by silence, and that we are willing to take the steps necessary to nurture our emotional well-being, regardless of the uncertainties that may lie ahead. In the end, the act of choosing to communicate, particularly in the spaces where silence has reigned, is a profound expression of self-awareness, vulnerability, and emotional courage. It's about breaking free from the confines of our internal thoughts and stepping into a place where connection can thrive, whether that connection leads to clarity, understanding, or simply the act of speaking our truth. Communication allows us to acknowledge our emotional needs, to honor our feelings, and to create the space for growth, both within ourselves and with others. But it's not just about the words we speak, it's about the willingness to be vulnerable, to risk the unknown, and to trust that by sharing ourselves authentically, we are always moving towards deeper understanding, stronger relationships, and a more fulfilling connection with the world around us. By choosing to communicate, we choose to embrace the messiness, the uncertainties, and the beauty that comes with human connection, knowing that every step taken toward understanding is a step toward greater emotional freedom and growth.